Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I am here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let me take you back to the time I moved into my first home. It was a quiet, unassuming house on the outskirts of a small town. Nothing extravagant, just a one-story, two-bedroom place with an old-fashioned charm that I found comforting. The kind of house that had history, but not the kind that raised eyebrows. I had just turned 30 and was ready to settle into a life that didn't involve noisy neighbors or city traffic. The house was affordable, with a spacious yard, and most importantly, it gave me the solitude I had always wanted. It wasn't in perfect condition, though. The hardwood floors creaked in certain spots, and the plumbing had its quirks, but I didn't mind. It felt like a project, something I could make my own over time. The previous owner, an elderly man, had lived there for decades before passing away. According to the realtor, he had no close relatives, so the house sat empty for months before going up for sale. I wasn't superstitious, and the idea of living in a place where someone had died didn't bother me. People pass away in homes all the time. It's just a fact of life. My daily routine was simple. I worked remotely as a freelance writer, which meant I spent most of my time indoors. I'd wake up early, make coffee in the small but functional kitchen, and set up my laptop by the window overlooking the backyard. The mornings were peaceful, filled with the sound of rustling leaves and the occasional car passing in the distance. At night, I'd unwind by reading or watching a movie. The house had a certain stillness that I appreciated. No loud neighbors, no unexpected noises, just the occasional groan of the old wooden structure settling. The only thing that ever seemed a little off was the floor in the hallway near my bedroom. It had a slightly uneven feel to it, almost like there was an air pocket underneath. But I figured it was just old floorboards shifting over time. During my first few weeks there, everything was normal. I painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and slowly turned the place into something that felt like home. It was peaceful, predictable, and exactly what I needed. But that sense of normalcy didn't last. At first, it was small things. A misplaced object, a door that I swore I had left open but found closed. Little moments that I brushed off as me being forgetful. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, and honestly, I had always been skeptical of ghost stories. But soon, I started noticing something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the floor. Not all the time, just at odd moments. A soft, shifting noise, like something moving just beneath the wooden planks. I told myself it was the house settling. After all, it was an old home. The structure probably had gaps, maybe even rodents. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard it again. A faint scraping noise, followed by a dull thud. It came from the hallway, the same place where the floor felt uneven. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Houses make noises. It was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself I'd check it out later, maybe pull up a floorboard and see if there was anything underneath. But life got in the way. Work kept me busy, and my logical side convinced me it wasn't worth the effort. I had more important things to do than poke around under my own floor. That was my first mistake. For a while, I ignored the strange noises coming from the floor. I chalked them up to the house settling, an old structure shifting as temperatures changed. It wasn't until one particular night that I started to reconsider. It was late, probably around 2 in the morning. I had been struggling with a deadline and was running on caffeine and pure exhaustion. My laptop screen glowed against the darkened room as I typed, the silence around me heavy. That's when I heard it again. A faint scratching sound. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was coming from the hallway, the same spot where the floor always felt slightly off. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate sound, like something dragging along the underside of the floorboards. I turned off my laptop screen and listened, my heart pounding against my ribs. The noise didn't stop. If anything, it grew more distinct. Scratch, scratch, thud. My pulse spiked. It wasn't random creaking or the sound of wood expanding. This was something moving, something below me. I stood up slowly, my chair making a quiet scrape against the wooden floor. My body felt stiff, like I had been sitting too long, but I forced myself to walk to the hallway. The house was dark except for the faint glow from my laptop. I flicked on the hallway light, expecting to see what? A crack in the floor. A mouse. Something that made sense? But there was nothing. Just the same worn floorboards, the same dim hallway stretching toward my bedroom. Still, the sound continued. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where the noise seemed the loudest. It was right near the wall, where the floor had always felt just a little bit off. I exhaled, rubbing the back of my neck. It's probably mice. That was the only logical explanation. The house was old, and maybe there was a small gap somewhere that rodents had slipped into. It made sense. Satisfied with my reasoning, I walked back to my desk, trying to push the unease from my mind. But as soon as I sat down, something happened that made my stomach drop. The noise followed me. It shifted, no longer coming from the hallway, but directly beneath where I was sitting. A slow, deliberate scrape against the floorboards. I bolted up from my chair so fast that it nearly tipped over. My breath came short and quick, and my skin prickled with cold sweat. This wasn't normal. It wasn't just the house settling, and it wasn't just mice. I turned on every light in the house, pacing from room to room, checking for any gaps in the floor, any holes in the walls. I searched for any possible explanation, but I found nothing. Eventually, the noise stopped. Just stopped. I waited, standing in the middle of my living room, arms crossed tightly over my chest. Minutes passed, and there was only silence. I felt ridiculous. I was a grown man, jumping at sounds in my own house. This was nothing. Maybe I was just overtired. Yeah, that had to be it. I turned off the lights, took a deep breath, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body still tense. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. Scratch, scratch, thud. This time, it was right beneath my bed. The noise under my bed didn't stop right away. It wasn't frantic, nor was it loud enough to make me jump out of bed. But it was there, persistent, deliberate. Scratch, scratch, thud. I held my breath, lying perfectly still, my body tense with unease. The sound was too distinct, too methodical to be random. I forced myself to listen, trying to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. The floor, right beneath me. A cold wave of dread crawled up my spine. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to acknowledge that something was wrong. But my mind was racing, going over every possible explanation. It had to be an animal, right? A rat, maybe a raccoon that had somehow gotten stuck underneath the house. But the weight of the sound didn't match that. It wasn't the rapid scurrying of tiny feet or the frantic scratching of a trapped animal. This was slow, deliberate, as if something was pressing against the underside of the floor. And then it stopped. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Slowly, I exhaled, rolling onto my side and gripping the edge of the blanket. I stayed like that for a long time, my body rigid with exhaustion and fear, until finally, sleep took over. When I woke up, The first thing I did was check the floor. The wood looked the same as it always had, aged but sturdy, no visible cracks or gaps. If something had been moving underneath, there should have been a sign. Claw marks, dust shifted, anything. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, walking along the perimeter of the house. The foundation was made of concrete, with no easy access to a crawl space. I would have to get inside from the floor itself. That's when a thought crossed my mind. Was there even a crawl space at all? I didn't remember seeing one on the listing. Some older homes had sealed off floors, meaning there shouldn't have been room for anything to move beneath them. That realization made my stomach turn. I went back inside, standing over the hallway where the first noises had started. The floor was solid, but when I pressed down with my foot, I could feel that slight shift again, that almost imperceptible give, like there was something hollow beneath it. That evening, I made a plan. I was going to check under the floor. It was just after sunset when I grabbed a crowbar from the shed. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down in the hallway, pressing my fingers against the worn wood. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse thudding in my ears. And then, knock, knock. I froze. The sound had come from beneath the floor. A slow, hollow knock. 2 beats, perfectly spaced. I dropped the crowbar, stumbling back so fast that I nearly tripped over myself. My breath came in sharp gasps, my mind scrambling for logic. It had to be an echo, right? The old wood shifting? Maybe I had put pressure on it in just the right way, but I knew better. I waited, my hands trembling as I gripped the crowbar again. Silence stretched around me, thick and suffocating. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. Finally, I forced myself to move. I wedged the crowbar between the cracks and pried at the floorboard. It groaned in protest, but then, with a sharp snap, it lifted. The smell hit me first. A damp, musty scent mixed with something else, something faintly metallic. My stomach twisted as I leaned forward, aiming my flashlight into the darkness below. And that's when I saw it. A space. A narrow, man-made gap running beneath the floor. Not a crawl space, not an unfinished basement. It was a passage carved into the earth itself. And it was big enough for someone to fit inside. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the flashlight. The beam wavered slightly as I adjusted it, trying to see deeper. The passage stretched into the darkness, the dirt walls uneven, as if they had been dug by hand. And then I saw something that made my skin crawl. Fingerprints, smudged into the dirt walls. Some pressed deep into the surface, as if someone had been gripping the sides to pull themselves forward. I shot up, heart pounding so hard it hurt. No, 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 no. I slammed the floorboard back down and stumbled away. My entire body felt cold, like the heat had drained from my skin. There was no explanation for this. No logical reason why there would be a passage underneath my house. And more importantly, no reason why someone had been down there. I forced myself to breathe. Call someone. Call the police. Do something. But my phone was in my bedroom. I turned toward the hallway, my footsteps unsteady as I made my way toward the room. The door was partially open, the dim light from the setting sun casting long shadows against the walls. And then, thud! A single, heavy impact from beneath the floor. I stopped dead in my tracks, my skin prickling with terror. Someone was down there. I moved faster, rushing into my room and grabbing my phone from the nightstand. My hands fumbled as I unlocked it, my breath ragged. But before I could dial, another thud. Closer this time. The floor shifted. I choked back a noise, my body rigid as I stared at the wooden boards beneath my feet. The pressure felt different, heavier, like something was right below me. I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the wall, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. Silence! And then, a long, slow scratch. The noise traveled beneath me, moving toward the bed. I bolted. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to grab anything else. I just ran through the hallway, past the living room, out the front door. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I sat in my car for hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. The house loomed in my rearview mirror, its windows dark and lifeless. I didn't go back inside that night. I checked into a motel, my skin still crawling with the memory of that sound. I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. Who had built that passage? Why was it there? And more importantly, who had been using it? The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was under my house. I sat in my car well into the morning, watching my house from a distance. The early morning sun had done nothing to chase away the lingering dread that sat heavy in my chest. My skin was clammy, my hands stiff from gripping the steering wheel all night. Every part of me wanted to drive away and never look back. Sell the house, leave whatever was beneath it alone. But I couldn't. Not without knowing. Someone had been moving under my floor. And if I left without figuring out what it was, the questions would haunt me forever. I took a deep breath, forcing my muscles to move, and stepped out of the car. The air felt thick, unnaturally still. The house, my house, looked different now, less like a home and more like a thing watching me back. I swallowed hard and walked to the front door. The second I stepped inside, I noticed something was off. The floor, where I had pulled up the boards the night before, was covered again. But not the way I had left it. The edges of the planks were misaligned. My pulse spiked. Someone had been in here. Someone had been inside while I was gone. I hesitated, listening. Silence! Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but I had already come this far. I had to finish what I started. I locked the door behind me and crept forward, every step cautious. My eyes never left the floor. I grabbed the crowbar I had left leaning against the wall and crouched down. My breath felt too loud in my ears. I slid the crowbar under the loose board. I hesitated, and then I pulled. The board came free with a low groan, revealing the dark space beneath. The scent of damp earth and something else, something foul, wafted up. I covered my nose with my sleeve and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the same passage I had seen last night. The dirt walls, the narrow crawl space. But something was different. There were drag marks. Fresh streaks in the dirt, as if something or someone had been pulled deeper into the tunnel. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to lean closer. The space was just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I didn't want to go down there, but I had to. The air was thick, suffocating as I lowered myself into the tunnel. The ground was uneven, cold. Every breath felt stale, like the space had been untouched for years. But it hadn't. I crawled forward, dragging my flashlight ahead of me. The further I went, the more the walls seemed to close in, pressing against my shoulders. The tunnel stretched on longer than it should have, leading deeper into the earth than my house should have allowed. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A handprint. Not just any handprint, a fresh one. Pressed into the dirt wall, fingers long and uneven, the palms slightly smeared, as if whoever had left it had been dragged. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and kept moving. The tunnel took a sharp turn, and I nearly dropped the flashlight when I saw what was ahead. A door. A wooden door, old and rotting, wedged into the dirt like it had been built there before the tunnel itself. The wood was cracked, the hinges rusted. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. But what made my skin crawl was the fact that the drag marks stopped right in front of it. Someone had gone inside, or been pulled in. I hesitated, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I reached for the handle. It was ice cold. I turned it. The door groaned, the hinges resisting before finally giving way. The scent that rushed out was suffocating, rotting wood, damp earth, and something metallic. My flashlight flickered. The room was small, the walls lined with crumbling brick. The ceiling was low, lower than the tunnel itself. And in the center of the room was a chair. An old, wooden chair, its legs uneven. The wood was dark, too dark, stained. And there were ropes. Thick, frayed ropes dangled from the armrests, tied in loops, worn from use. I took a step back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The walls felt like they were closing in. And then, a sound. Not behind me. Not from the tunnel. From inside the room. A breath. Shallow. Ragged. Right next to me. I turned so fast I nearly fell, the flashlight swinging wildly. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, pressed against the wall, was a figure. Thin. Too thin. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over sharp bones. It was hunched over, its long arms wrapped around its knees. The fingers, long, bony fingers, twitched against the dirt. And its eyes, sunken hollow, were wide open, staring at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It opened its mouth. The jaw cracked. And then it crawled toward me. I scrambled backward, my body acting before my brain could catch up. My feet slid against the dirt as I stumbled out of the room, gasping for air. The figure moved fast, faster than it should have. Its hands scraped against the ground, its body twisting unnaturally as it lunged. I threw myself backward, barely dodging as its hand, those long skeletal fingers, snatched at my ankle. The door. The door. I kicked out, my boots slamming against its arm. The bones cracked, or maybe it was just the sound of the wood as I shoved the door shut. I didn't wait. I ran, crawling, clawing my way out of that tunnel as fast as I could. The walls scraped my arms, my knees slammed against the hard ground, but I didn't care. I could hear it. Behind me. Moving. Fast. The light ahead grew brighter. I was so close. And then, a hand. It grabbed my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly. My boot connected with something solid. The grip loosened. I hurled myself forward, clawing at the edge of the opening, pulling myself out of the floor. I slammed the board back into place, my breath ragged. My vision blurred with panic, but I didn't stop. I grabbed the nearest piece of furniture and shoved it over the loose floorboards. The silence that followed was deafening. I pressed myself against the wall, gasping for breath. My body trembled violently, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the flashlight. I listened. Nothing. But I knew whatever was down there was still there, and it had tried to pull me down with it. I don't know how long I sat there, back pressed against the wall, staring at the piece of furniture I had shoved over the floorboards. My lungs burned from breathing too fast, my chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven movements. My entire body trembled, not from exhaustion, but from something much worse. Fear. A fear so primal it had taken over everything else. I wasn't supposed to make it out of that tunnel. That thing had tried to keep me there. It had grabbed me. And the worst part, it had felt human. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands gripping my knees. My skin was clammy, my shirt soaked through with sweat. The silence felt unbearable. I strained my ears, listening, but there was nothing. No movement beneath the floor. No breathing, no scratching. Had it gone? Or was it waiting? I forced my stiff limbs to move, bracing my hands against the floor to push myself up. Every muscle ached from crawling through that tunnel, from fighting against something I shouldn't have survived. The moment I was on my feet, I backed away from the covered floorboards, never taking my eyes off them. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house. I didn't care about my things. I didn't care about anything except putting as much distance between myself and whatever was down there as possible. My legs felt unsteady, like they didn't belong to me, but I forced myself to move. I reached for my phone, only to realize it wasn't in my pocket. I had dropped it. Somewhere in the tunnel. A sharp shudder ran through me. It didn't matter. I wasn't going back for it. I didn't need a phone to leave. I turned and hurried toward the door, every step feeling like a lifetime. The moment I reached for the handle, my breath hitched. The lock was undone. I knew for a fact I had locked the door behind me when I entered. But now, the deadbolt was turned back. Like someone had been here. Like someone had left. A fresh chill ran down my spine. I hesitated, swallowing the bile in my throat before twisting the knob and pulling the door open. The air outside felt unnaturally cold for this time of day. The sun was out, but the warmth didn't reach me. I stepped onto the porch, feeling exposed, like eyes were watching me from inside the house. I turned back, staring at the open door, my chest tightening. Did I close it? I should have. I should have slammed it shut, locked it. But I didn't, because something in me whispered that it didn't matter anymore. I was never going back inside. I climbed into my car with shaking hands, my fingers fumbling with the keys. I shoved them into the ignition, twisting with more force than necessary. The engine roared to life, and I barely remembered to check my mirrors before peeling out of the driveway. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to glance back at the house as I sped away. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to be anywhere but here. Hours later, after driving aimlessly, I found myself parked at an old diner off the highway. My hands still hadn't stopped shaking, and my throat felt dry as sandpaper. I ordered coffee, but I barely touched it. Instead, I sat there, staring at the table, trying to process everything. I wanted to believe I had imagined it. That exhaustion had made me hallucinate, that my mind had played tricks on me. But my body knew it was real. The aches in my arms and legs, the scratches along my skin, the faint bruise on my ankle where something had grabbed me. It was all real. And that meant I needed answers. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for any history on my house. I had never cared much about who lived there before me. It bought it at a good price, and that had been enough. But now, I needed to know why there was a tunnel beneath my floor. It didn't take long before I found something. A newspaper article. My stomach clenched as I read the headline. Missing persons case remains unsolved. Last seen near my address. I clicked on it, my breath catching in my throat as I read. The article was from 30 years ago. A young man, early 20s, lived alone, had gone missing. The last place he had been seen? My house. Or rather, the house that stood before mine. It had been torn down and rebuilt. No remains were ever found. No sign of a struggle. Just gone. I sat back in my seat, the blood draining from my face. Had I just seen him? Had I just escaped the same fate? I shut the laptop, my stomach twisting painfully. If that thing I saw was him, if he had been trapped under there all this time, then who had locked my front door? I should have called someone. The police, a priest, a demolition crew, but I didn't. Instead, I drove to the nearest hardware store and bought everything I needed. Concrete, plywood, nails, heavy-duty locks. And then I went back, not inside, just to the yard. I worked until my muscles burned, until my hands were raw. And when I was done, the entrance to that tunnel was sealed, buried under layers of concrete, permanently. That night, I booked a motel. I told myself I would sell the house first thing in the morning. But when I finally collapsed onto the motel bed, exhaustion winning out over fear, I heard it, a sound I should never have been able to hear. A knock, coming from the motel floor. I lay there on the stiff motel bed, my breath shallow, my body rigid. The knock hadn't been loud. It hadn't been aggressive. But it had come from below me. My fingers dug into the motel sheets. It wasn't possible. The house was miles away. The tunnel was sealed. Buried. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just a coincidence, a noise from another room, maybe a pipe shifting in the old building. But the moment I tried to convince myself, another knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps against the floor, and then a drag, something scraping against the wood beneath me. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. I forced myself to sit up, my skin clammy, my fingers trembling. The motel room felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet pressing against the thin carpet. The air felt thick, heavy. I had to leave. I needed to leave. But as soon as I reached for my bag, as soon as my fingers curled around the strap, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then the entire room plunged into darkness. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my things, stumbled toward the door, fumbling for the handle. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. As soon as my fingers closed around the knob, I felt it. Something cold. Something pressing against my back. Not a hand. Not fingers. Something worse. Something that felt like air shifting. Like a presence leaning in. I yanked the door open and ran. Out of the room. Down the hall. Out into the cold, open night. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, slamming the door shut, my chest heaving. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I knew. I knew. It had followed me. I drove until the sun started rising, my hands locked around the steering wheel. I didn't have a destination. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I was far away. From the motel. From the house. From whatever had crawled out from under my floor. That was months ago. I never went back to that house. Never even looked at the listing when I sold it for next to nothing. I've moved twice since then. Different cities. Different states. But sometimes, when everything is quiet, when I'm lying in bed at night, in a place where no one should be beneath me, I hear it. Faint. Soft. 3 knocks. And a slow, dragging sound. I don't know if it's real. I don't want to know. But if you're watching this, I need to ask you something. If you're in your room, alone, with no one below you, listen. And if you hear it, this was about 5 years ago. I was in my early 20s, fresh out of school, and desperate for a job that paid well. Night shifts in a hospital weren't exactly my dream, but they offered good money in a quiet environment. Most of my work involved pushing supply carts, cleaning equipment, and running lab samples between floors. Nothing too complicated. It was the kind of job that let me keep to myself, which I liked. The hospital itself was old, one of those places that had been expanded and remodeled so many times that it didn't really have a single, cohesive design. The upper floors looked modern, full of bright lights and updated tech, but the lower levels? They were another story. The basement, in particular, felt like a completely different world. That's where I spent most of my nights. The basement was divided into a few sections: the laundry room, the maintenance area, and a few storage rooms for old medical files. There were also some locked doors I never questioned, rooms that didn't appear on any of my task lists, and no one ever talked about them. But the worst part? The elevator. There were plenty of elevators in the hospital, but the basement one was different. It was old, probably the original from when the hospital was first built. It had been updated at some point, but it still had that heavy, clunky feel. It moved slower than the others, and when the doors shut, it felt like the air was being sucked out of the small space. It was the only way down to the basement at night, and I grew to hate it very quickly. Most of the time, I worked alone. Sometimes, a few other night shift workers would pass through, janitors, lab techs, or security guards, but for the most part, it was just me, the hum of the industrial lighting, and the quiet beeping of machines that never stopped running. At first, I didn't mind the solitude. It was peaceful in a way. I'd bring my coffee, listen to the distant sounds of hospital life above me, and focus on my tasks. But as the weeks went on, I started feeling like I wasn't alone down there. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things. The sensation of movement in my peripheral vision when I knew no one else was around. The way the air would feel colder near certain doors. The strange, faint smell of antiseptic mixed with something rotten that would come and go without warning. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was working in a place full of medical waste, chemical cleaners, and old ventilation systems. It wasn't strange for the air to shift or for odd smells to linger. But then I started noticing the elevator. It would move on its own. Not just from people using it on other floors. No, this was different. It'd be standing in the basement, loading a supply cart, and hear the distinct ding of the elevator arriving. The doors would slide open, revealing an empty interior. No one inside. No one waiting for it. And when I checked the buttons, there was no floor selected. At first, I thought it was a mechanical glitch. Maybe a sensor issue or a problem with the wiring. But then it started happening more often. It'd be halfway down the hallway, and I'd hear the ding behind me. It'd turn, and there it was, doors wide open, waiting. Sometimes it'd step inside, press the button for the main floor, and ride up. Other times, it'd just ignore it, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But the feeling never went away. That unnatural silence inside the elevator. The way the doors stayed open just a little longer than they should. The way I felt like something was waiting. Then, one night, something changed. The elevator didn't just open on its own. It called me. The first time it happened, I was standing at the far end of the basement, stacking supply boxes in the storage room. It was a slow night, and I was almost done with my tasks. The only thing left was a quick check on the medical waste bins before heading upstairs. Then I heard it. Ding! The elevator. I paused, letting the sound settle in the quiet hallway. I wasn't near the elevator. No one else was down here. I wiped my hands on my uniform and peeked out of the storage room. The hallway stretched in both directions, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. At the far end, past the maintenance door and the old filing room, the elevator stood wide open. The doors just waited. I didn't move. There was no reason for it to be open. Elevators don't just arrive and stay like that unless someone calls them. Maybe a nurse or a janitor had pressed the button upstairs and then got sidetracked. That happens sometimes. But something felt off. I stared at the empty interior. It wasn't just that the doors were open. It was the feeling I got standing there, watching. The air in the basement was always cool, but suddenly it felt stale, like whatever circulated through the vents had stopped. The faint scent of bleach and old paper mixed with something else. Something sour. I swallowed hard. Then, without thinking, I took a step back. The second my foot shifted, the doors slammed shut. Not the normal, slow close of hospital elevators. The doors snapped together with a force that made my chest tighten. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, bouncing off the tiled floors and metal shelves. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It's just a malfunction. That's all. I turned back into the storage room, forcing myself to focus on my work. I pushed the last few boxes onto the shelves and checked my watch. Half an hour left in my shift. I could finish the waste check and get out of here. As I grabbed the supply cart and wheeled it into the hallway, I kept my eyes straight ahead. I refused to glance at the elevator. But as I walked past it, I couldn't ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. Something was waiting. Over the next few nights, I tried to shake off what had happened. I told myself it was a one-time thing. The elevator was old. Maybe the wiring was faulty. Maybe I had just caught it at the exact moment someone upstairs called it, and I was overthinking everything. But then, it happened again. This time, I was in the maintenance room, replacing some gloves and disinfectant wipes. The room was small, filled with shelves of cleaning supplies and old equipment. It had one of those heavy-duty doors that never stayed open on its own. I was crouched down, rearranging a crate of gloves, when I heard the ding. My breath hitched. Slowly, I stood up and listened. The elevator doors were open again. I could feel it, even though I couldn't see them from where I was standing. Then, the intercom crackled to life. Each floor in the hospital had an old intercom system, the kind that was supposed to be used only for emergencies or staff calls. It heard it a few times when nurses paged each other. But now, the static buzzed through the basement speaker, right outside the maintenance room. Then, a voice. A single word. My name. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a full sentence. Just my name. I froze, my stomach twisting in a way that made me feel sick. No one called me down here. The security guards barely acknowledged me. The nurses didn't page the basement unless there was a supply request. I stepped toward the door. The intercom crackled again, then went silent. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed, "Don't go out there." But the logical side of my brain fought back. What if it was a real page? Maybe someone needed something. Maybe a nurse had accidentally used the wrong channel. I gritted my teeth and pushed the door open. The hallway was empty, but the elevator doors were open. The small overhead light inside the elevator flickered, casting odd, shifting shadows on the floor. The buttons on the panel were dark. No floor had been selected. I took a step forward, my shoes scuffing against the tile. The air was wrong, thicker than before. The fluorescent light above the elevator buzzed softly, like something was pressing against the electricity. I swallowed. Then, just as I was about to turn away, the doors slammed shut. The sound rang through the basement, louder than it should have been. I took a shaky breath. My hands were clammy. My chest felt tight. I turned on my heel and walked fast back to the maintenance room, grabbed my cart, and forced myself up the stairs instead of taking the elevator. I didn't care how exhausted I was. I wasn't stepping inside that thing. I didn't talk about it with anyone. Who was I supposed to tell? The janitors? They didn't like the basement either, but they never said why. The security guards? They barely said more than 2 words to me. The nurses? They had real problems to deal with. So I kept my mouth shut. But once I started paying attention, I realized I wasn't the only one avoiding that elevator. One night, I saw one of the janitors, a guy who had been working there for over a decade, refuse to take it. I had just clocked in, heading down to the basement, when I saw him standing near the first floor elevator bank, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. He pressed the button for the basement. We stood there for a few seconds, waiting. Then, ding. The doors slid open. Empty. The janitor didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the open doors. I watched him, waiting for him to step inside. Instead, he turned and pushed his cart toward the stairwell. I hesitated. "You're not taking it?" I asked. He barely glanced at me. "I'll take the stairs." "It's not working right, huh?" I forced a chuckle, trying to sound casual. "Keeps opening for no reason." His hands tightened on the cart handle. Then he said, "It's not broken." I frowned. "Then why?" Before I could finish, he was already pushing the door open and disappearing into the stairwell. I stood there, staring at the elevator. The doors were still open, still waiting. A cold, uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I didn't take the elevator that night, and I wasn't the only one avoiding it. Over the next few shifts, I noticed the security guards never used it. The night nurses always took the main elevators, even if it meant a longer walk. One of the older lab techs flinched every time she heard the basement elevators chime. Something was wrong with it. Something none of them wanted to talk about. And then, one night, I found out why. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. That's what I wanted to believe. But after that night with the janitor, it got worse. The elevator wasn't just malfunctioning. It was waiting, watching, and it wanted me to step inside. The first time it followed me, I was pushing a supply cart down the hall. It was almost 3 a.m., the dead hour. The fluorescent lights flickered in their usual, unreliable way, casting long, jittering shadows across the floor. The basement had a strange hum to it, like the building itself was breathing. As I walked past the filing room, I heard the elevator ding. I stopped. It was open again. I took a slow breath, gripping the cart handle. I wasn't going to look. I wasn't going to give it attention. I kept walking. Then, ding. Again. And this time, I heard something shift. Not a person. Not footsteps. Just movement. A slight creak. A shuffle. Like something adjusting inside the elevator. I gritted my teeth. Just keep walking. Just keep walking. I reached the maintenance room, shoved the cart inside, and shut the door behind me. The second it clicked shut, the intercom crackled to life again. That same static buzz. That same sick feeling curling in my stomach. Then, the whisper, "Come in." My heart slammed against my ribs. I backed away from the door, my breathing uneven. The intercom cut out with a sharp pop, and the silence that followed was almost worse. The basement wasn't quiet. It was heavy, like the air itself was pressing down. Then, from the hallway, ding! And then, the sound of something dragging. Long, slow, scraping. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms. I wasn't going out there. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. The intercom didn't turn back on. The elevator didn't open again. But that night, when I finally forced myself to go back upstairs, I felt it. Something was getting closer, and it wasn't going to stop. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed proof. If I told anyone, they'd think I was losing it. But if I could see something, anything, on the security cameras, maybe you'd know what I was dealing with. I waited until my next shift, then found one of the security guards who didn't mind small talk. He was an older guy, worked nights like me, and had a habit of keeping the cameras running on his phone while he played card games at his desk. I leaned against the counter. "Hey man, quick question." He barely looked up. "What's up? You ever check the basement elevator feed?" His fingers hesitated on his screen. Then he looked at me. It was subtle, just a flicker of his eyes, a brief hesitation, but it was enough. He knew. I forced a casual shrug. "It's been acting weird lately." He exhaled through his nose. Then, after a pause, he tapped on his phone, switching screens. "Which night?" he muttered. I swallowed. 2 nights ago, around 3. He scrolled through the footage. I watched over his shoulder, my pulse hammering. The screen showed the basement hallway, the familiar sterile walls, the flickering lights. Then, the elevator doors slid open. Empty. The camera was angled perfectly. I could see the entire hallway, including myself as I pushed the cart. I watched myself pause, hesitate. Then the elevator dinged again. And then, my stomach dropped. The elevator's floor changed. Not in a normal way. Not a shadow. Not a reflection. For one frame, just a split second, the floor inside the elevator turned black. Not dark. Not shadowed. Black. Like the entire bottom of the elevator had been erased. Then the frame skipped, and it was back to normal. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry. The security guard was quiet. After a long pause, he muttered, "Yeah, it does that." I turned to him, my throat tightening. "What the hell does that mean?" He locked his phone, stood up, and grabbed his coat. Then he said, "Don't take the elevator." And he left. I should have quit. I wanted to quit. But something about the way he said it, the way he just accepted it, like it was an inevitable fact, made my skin crawl. I needed to know more. So the next night, when my shift ended, I didn't leave right away. I waited. The hospital emptied out. The halls grew quiet. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., I went back to the basement. The air felt thicker than before. I stepped into the hallway, my shoes scuffing against the tile. Every part of me screamed to turn around, but I kept moving. I passed the storage room, the maintenance room, the filing room. Then, slowly, I turned toward the elevator. It was already open. Waiting. The small overhead light flickered, casting odd shadows on the floor. The buttons on the panel were dark. No floor had been selected. I took a slow step forward. The air inside was different. Colder. Wrong. My hand twitched at my side. Then I saw it. A single footprint inside the elevator. Not from a shoe. Not a scuff mark. A bare footprint. Too long. Too thin. And pointing toward me. I ran. My legs burned as I bolted up the stairs, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until I reached the first floor, slammed through the stairwell door, and nearly collapsed against the wall. The security guard at the desk looked up, startled. "You okay?" I couldn't answer. I just gasped for breath, my hands shaking. I turned, staring back at the stairwell. The basement door was closed. The elevator hadn't followed me. But I knew it was still waiting, and it wouldn't wait forever. I didn't go back to the basement for 3 days. But it didn't matter, because the elevator came to me. By the 3rd night, I had convinced myself it was over. I stuck to the first floor, avoided anything below ground, and refused to even look at the elevator doors when I walked past. I wasn't stupid. Whatever was down there wasn't just a glitch, it was something else. Something I had no business messing with. So that night, when my shift ended, I went straight to the break room, sat at one of the plastic tables, and buried my face in my hands. I just needed a few minutes, just a few moments to breathe. The room was empty, quiet except for the hum of the vending machines. My pulse slowed. My mind started to clear. Then, knock, knock, knock. I froze. It came from the hallway. I turned my head slowly, staring at the break room door. Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks. Even, rhythmic, too precise. I didn't move. The break room was supposed to be safe. It was nowhere near the basement. It wasn't even close to the elevators. So how the hell was something knocking from the hallway? My breath hitched. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Then, in the silence that followed, I heard something else. A low, mechanical hum. The elevator. I shot to my feet. No, it couldn't be. But I already knew. I stepped forward, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. I pushed the door open, just a crack. And there it was. The elevator. Right outside the break room. Waiting. My stomach twisted. My throat clenched shut. This wasn't possible. The break room was nowhere near the main elevators. There was no logical way for it to be here. But it was. And the doors were open, waiting for me. I backed away. My hands trembled. Every muscle in my body screamed to run. Then I saw the footprints. Not just one. A whole trail of them. Bare. Too long. Too thin. Leading from the elevator to the break room door. To me. The lights flickered. The intercom crackled. And then, a voice. Step inside. I should have run. But I couldn't move. My legs locked in place. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. The elevator doors started to close. And that's when I made the worst mistake of my life. I took a step forward. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something else. Something I couldn't fight. But the second my foot touched the elevator floor, the doors slammed shut. The light overhead flickered, buzzing loudly. The buttons were gone. Not blank. Gone. No panel. No numbers. No emergency switch. Just smooth, cold metal. The floor vibrated beneath me. A low, mechanical groan rumbled through the walls. The elevator wasn't stopping. It was going down. I pressed my back against the wall, my chest tightening. How far down could it go? The hospital only had 2 basement levels, but the numbers weren't changing. There was no way to tell how far I was going. And the air, it was wrong. Thick, heavy, like I was being buried alive. Then, the hum stopped. A dead, suffocating silence filled the elevator. Then, with a slow, painful creak, the doors slid open. I couldn't breathe, because I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I wasn't anywhere. The hallway in front of me stretched into an impossible darkness. The walls were gray, damp, and lined with doors, dozens of them, each one identical. No signs, no numbers, no way out. The air smelled like rot. The elevator let out a mechanical groan. The doors started closing, and I panicked. I lunged forward. My shoulders slammed against the metal. Too late. The doors snapped shut behind me, and the elevator was gone. I turned in circles, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. No signal. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with those identical unmarked doors. Something shifted in the distance. A faint sound, a breath. Not mine. I swallowed hard. My hands balled into fists. I wasn't alone. I had 2 choices. Stay here and wait for whatever was breathing in the dark, or move. I chose the second. My footsteps echoed against the damp floor. I moved slowly, each step careful, calculated. The air grew colder. The doors on either side of me felt wrong, like they weren't supposed to be opened, like something was behind them. I kept going. Then I heard it. A door creaked open behind me. Not fast, not loud, slow, deliberate. My breath caught. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Something stepped out. Soft, wet, bare feet against the floor. Too long, too thin. I moved faster. The air pressed in. The sound of footsteps behind me didn't stop. The hallway stretched too far. The walls seemed to curve, bend, like I was inside something that was alive. Then, the intercom crackled from every direction, and the voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the endless hallway, the footsteps behind me growing faster. Then, up ahead, a light, bright, white. The elevator. Its doors were open, waiting. I forced my legs to move faster, my muscles screaming. The footsteps behind me broke into a run. A long, low breath shuddered through the hallway. I lunged forward. The second I crossed the threshold, something grabbed my ankle. I hit the elevator floor hard, my chest slamming against the metal. I felt it. Fingers. Too long, too thin, wrapping around my leg. Pulling. I kicked. I thrashed. I clawed at the ground. The grip tightened. The voice whispered again. "Stay!" I screamed. The elevator lurched. The doors slammed shut on its hand. The thing shrieked. A sound that wasn't human, wasn't natural. The hand twitched, spasmed, then recoiled. The doors shut completely, and the elevator shot up. The next thing I knew, I was on the first floor. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding. I scrambled out, gasping for air. The hospital was normal. The lights, the halls, the distant beeping of machines. Like nothing had happened. But my ankle, it was bruised. Like something had really grabbed me. The elevator behind me sat open. Still, silent. I backed away. And as I turned, I heard it. A final whisper. Soft, almost amused. "Next time, don't run." I never touched that elevator again. The next morning, I sat in my car, staring at the hospital entrance. My shift started in 10 minutes. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My whole body ached, like I had spent hours running for my life. Because I had. But what was I supposed to do? Walk inside and tell my supervisor, "Hey, just a heads up, the basement elevator is haunted, and I got dragged into a place that shouldn't exist by something that shouldn't be real." I'd lose my job. Maybe even get a psych evaluation. So I forced my body to move. I stepped out of the car, grabbed my bag, and walked through the automatic sliding doors like nothing had happened. The second I entered the lobby, my stomach twisted, because the first thing I saw was the elevator, sitting there, open, waiting. My chest tightened. My hands turned clammy. Then, a nurse walked right inside. The doors shut. The elevator worked like normal, like it hadn't swallowed me whole the night before. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to focus. This was reality. I clung to that thought like a life raft as I made my way to the nurse's station. But deep down, I already knew the truth. It wasn't over. By the second night, I noticed something was wrong with my ankle. At first, I thought it was just a regular bruise. Dark, ugly, wrapping around the exact spot where that thing had grabbed me. But bruises fade. This one didn't. Days passed, then a week. The pain went away, but the mark stayed. And every time I looked at it, a cold shiver crawled up my spine. Like I could still feel it. Like I wasn't really free. The worst part wasn't the bruise. It was the dreams. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that basement. Back in that impossible hallway with the unmarked doors. Back in the dark. In my dreams, the elevator was never there. Only the hallway. Only the doors. And something waiting in the distance. Watching. Breathing. Getting closer. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help, because no matter what I did, the dreams always ended the same way. A whisper in my ear. A voice that wasn't mine. Next time, don't run. One night, about 2 weeks later, something happened that nearly made me quit. I was doing a routine check on a patient. She was older, frail, hooked up to machines that beeped softly in the background. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. She barely acknowledged me as I checked her vitals. Then, right as I turned to leave, she grabbed my wrist. Her grip was too strong for someone in her condition. My breath hitched. I looked down at her and froze because she was staring at my ankle, at the bruise. Her lips trembled. Her fingers dug into my skin. Then, in a raspy whisper, she said, "It followed you back." A sharp chill ran through my entire body. I pulled away, stumbled back. Her eyes met mine. Cloudy, unfocused, but her expression, she knew. I left the room without another word. After that, I started noticing things. Shadows moving at the edge of my vision. The elevator doors opening when no one was there. Lights flickering only when I walked past. At first, I convinced myself it was just stress, sleep deprivation, my mind playing tricks on me. But then, one night, as I was walking past the stairwell, I heard it. Footsteps. Bare. Wet. Slow. Coming from the basement. I told myself not to look. I looked anyway. The stairwell was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were coming closer. I ran. The last time I ever worked a night shift, I was alone at the nurse's station, filling out paperwork. It was 3 a.m. The hospital was quiet, too quiet. Then, the intercom crackled. My pen slipped from my fingers. The static buzzed through the empty hallways, sharp and wrong. Then, a voice. Low, familiar. "You shouldn't be here." Every hair on my body stood on end. I turned, and the elevator doors slid open. But the inside, it wasn't the hospital anymore. It was the hallway. The basement hallway. The unmarked doors. The impossible dark. Waiting. I stood there, frozen, staring into that elevator. Then, something moved inside. Not fast. Not loud. Slow. Deliberate. Stepping forward. Coming for me. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the freezing night. That was the last shift I ever worked. I quit the next morning. Even after leaving the hospital, I still see it. Elevators opening when I pass. Dreams of that endless hallway. Shadows that move when they shouldn't. The bruise on my ankle never faded. Some nights, when I lie awake in bed, I swear I can still hear it. A whisper, a voice from the dark. Next time, don't run. It's been months since I quit. I moved out of town, started fresh somewhere new, found a job that doesn't require me to step foot in a hospital. But every now and then, it happens. I'll be out somewhere, at a mall, an office building, even my own apartment complex. And an elevator will open. The timing is always too perfect. I'll be walking past, not even paying attention, and then, ding! Doors sliding open. Empty. Waiting. A cold sweat breaks out on my skin every time. Because I know it's not random. It's for me. And I never, ever step inside. I don't sleep much anymore. Because every time I do, I go back there. Back to the basement. Back to the hallway that shouldn't exist. I see the doors. The ones I never opened. And I feel it. That presence. Still waiting. Still watching. Closer than before. Sometimes in the dream, I hear something behind one of the doors. A faint rustling. A creak like old hinges shifting. A breath that isn't mine. And I know, if I ever open one, I won't wake up. There's something I need to say. Something important. If you ever find yourself alone in a hospital late at night, if you ever see an elevator open by itself, and if something deep in your gut screams at you not to step inside, listen. Because I didn't. And I've never been the same. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some places exist outside of what we understand. And some things, once they see you, they never let go. This happened when I was 23. I had just moved into my first real apartment, a small but comfortable place in an older building on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. The place had character, hardwood floors that creaked underfoot, high ceilings that made it feel more spacious than it was, and tall windows that let in just the right amount of light during the day. The apartment complex itself had been around for decades, the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely, but mostly kept to themselves. It had a mix of people, elderly residents who had lived there for years, a few young professionals, and the occasional college student looking for something affordable. The building had seen better days, but it was solid, with thick walls that muffled most of the outside noise. I worked late hours at a small printing shop downtown. It wasn't a dream job, but it paid the bills. Most nights, I'd come home after dark, heat up whatever leftovers I had, and watch TV until I felt tired enough to sleep. My routine was predictable, almost monotonous. Wake up, work, come home, repeat. The only person I really talked to in the building was my upstairs neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Thompson. She had lived there for over 30 years and knew everything about the place. She was the kind of person who always had a story to tell about former tenants, strange happenings in the building, or just gossip about the people who lived there. She had a way of making everything sound dramatic, but I never took her too seriously. "You know," she once said, leaning in as if sharing a secret, "this building has seen its fair share of odd things. People come and go, but some, they leave something behind." I smiled, humoring her. "Like what? Ghosts?" She chuckled but didn't answer right away. Instead, she just gave me this knowing look, the kind that made me wonder if she was messing with me or if she really believed what she was saying. But I didn't press her for details. At the time, I wasn't interested. The layout of my apartment was simple. A small kitchen that opened into the living room, a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom, and one large window in the living room that faced the street below. That window was my favorite part of the apartment. During the day, it let in the perfect amount of sunlight, and at night, I could sit on the couch and watch the quiet street below. There was something oddly comforting about it, a sense of being connected to the world outside without actually being part of it. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. I settled into my routine, got used to the little quirks of the apartment, the way the pipes groaned when the heat kicked on, the occasional flicker of the old kitchen light. the distant sound of footsteps from the unit above mine. Nothing unusual, nothing that stood out. Until one night, something did. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, half watching an old movie on TV. It was late, probably past midnight, but I wasn't tired yet. The street outside was quiet, just a few parked cars and the occasional flicker of headlights from someone driving past. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something in the window. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from the TV. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there. The glass showed only the dimly lit street outside. I shrugged it off. I was probably just tired. But something felt off, like the air in the room had changed. It was subtle, like a shift in pressure, an almost imperceptible heaviness that settled in my chest. I shook it off and went to bed. The next morning, everything was normal again. The feeling was gone. The window was just a window, and I almost forgot about it. Almost. That was the first time I noticed something strange. I didn't know it then, but it was only the beginning. The night after I noticed something in the window, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the light, maybe exhaustion from work. I had been spending too much time staring at screens anyway. My phone, my TV, my computer at the shop. It was easy to explain away something so small. I didn't even mention it to Mrs. Thompson when I ran into her the next day. She asked how I was settling in, and I told her everything was great. And at the time, I believed it. That night, I followed my usual routine. Got home, reheated some leftovers, watched TV, and scrolled through my phone. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the smallest noises seem louder. The occasional creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of footsteps from upstairs. Normal apartment sounds. But when I glanced at the window, that strange feeling came back. At first, it was just an uneasiness, a faint awareness of something I couldn't put into words. I turned my attention back to the TV, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't right. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just a feeling that settled at the base of my spine, an itch in my mind that wouldn't go away. I told myself not to look, but I did anyway. And there it was. A shadow. Not a reflection, not the movement of headlights from outside. A shape, tall, still, featureless, standing just outside the window. My breath caught in my throat. My first thought was that it had to be someone on the street. But I lived on the second floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing anyone could stand on. The only way someone could be outside my window was if they were floating. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. I sat frozen for a moment, heart pounding. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it had been my own reflection, some weird play of light from the TV. I stood up and moved toward the window, pressing my palm against the glass. Nothing. Just the empty street below. I let out a shaky breath, shaking my head at myself. I was being ridiculous. Still, I closed the curtains that night. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was soft but insistent, coming from the front door. I checked the time, 7:12 a.m., too early for maintenance, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I got up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and made my way to the door. When I opened it, no one was there. The hallway was empty. I frowned, stepping out into the hall and looking both ways. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to close the door, I saw it, something small, lying just outside my apartment. A single, black feather. I bent down, picking it up. It was soft, almost silky, but there was something strange about it. The color was too dark, too deep, like ink that had soaked into the fibers. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling an odd chill crawl up my arm. Then, a voice from behind startled me. Strange thing to find, isn't it? I turned quickly to see Mrs. Thompson standing a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the feather in my hand. I forced a chuckle. Yeah, I guess so. Maybe a bird got in the hallway? She didn't smile. Instead, she just looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Birds don't come in here." I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I just nodded and went back inside. I put the feather on the kitchen counter and went about my morning, trying not to overthink it. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I left the curtains closed. But that didn't stop it. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. There was no loud noise, no alarm. Just a strange awareness, like something had pulled me out of sleep. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlights seeping through the curtains. My heart was pounding for no reason I could explain. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Not at the door. At the window. My stomach twisted. My mind screamed at me not to look, but my body moved on its own. I turned my head. The curtains were drawn, but behind them I could see the shape of a figure. A tall, unmoving silhouette pressed against the window. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the shadow shifted. It leaned in. A whisper of movement, like something brushing against the glass. My breath hitched. And then, nothing. The shape was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I told myself it had been a nightmare. Stress, exhaustion, and overactive imagination. But when I walked into the living room, my stomach dropped. The curtains, the ones I had closed the night before, were open. And on the floor beneath the window, another black feather lay waiting. I didn't touch the feather. Not at first. I just stood there, staring at it, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't name. The logical part of my brain told me to pick it up, throw it away, and move on. But another part of me, the part that had been lying awake in the dark, listening to the sound of something tapping at my window, was screaming at me to leave it alone. The morning light did little to shake the unease that had settled in my bones. The rational explanations I had clung to before were slipping away, replaced by something I didn't want to admit. Something was watching me. I stepped back, forcing myself to look away from the feather. The apartment felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen. I walked to the kitchen, trying to focus on normal things: coffee, breakfast, the hum of the refrigerator. But as I stood there, pouring myself a cup, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A quick, fleeting shift of darkness near the window. I spun around, heart hammering. The curtains were still. The window was shut. There was nothing there. I let out a slow breath, gripping the counter. I was losing it. I had to be. Still, I checked the locks before I left for work. Twice. The day dragged on, each hour feeling longer than the last. The shop was slow, just a handful of customers coming in and out. I tried to focus on fixing a laptop someone had dropped off, but my mind kept drifting back to my apartment. To the shadow. To the feathers. To the tapping at my window. By the time I got home, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The sight should have been calming, but it wasn't. I hesitated outside my apartment door. Something was off. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. The air felt wrong, charged like the moments before a storm. My fingers tightened around the key. When I stepped inside, everything looked normal. The lights flickered on, the apartment silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. My breath came out slow, controlled. Nothing was wrong. I walked to the kitchen, set my bag down on the counter, and turned toward the living room. Then I stopped. The curtains were open again. A cold wave rolled over me. I had closed them before I left. I was sure of it. I forced myself forward, reaching out to grab the fabric, but just as my fingers touched it, a sound sent ice through my veins. A slow, deliberate knock. Not at the door. At the window. I froze. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't listen. Knock, knock, knock. Each tap was perfectly spaced, measured. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. This wasn't happening. I turned my head, just enough to see the glass. There was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, no sign of anything at all. And yet, knock, knock. The sound came again, softer this time, closer. My pulse roared in my ears. I grabbed the curtain and yanked it shut. The knocking stopped. I stood there for a long time, my hand gripping the fabric so tightly my knuckles ached. My breathing was unsteady, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the landlord. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I knew I sounded paranoid. Hey, do you know if anyone else has had issues with, I don't know, people messing around outside their windows? There was a pause on the other end. Then, no, not that I've heard. Why? Something happened? I hesitated. Just weird noises. I thought maybe someone was messing around outside. Another pause. Your apartment is on the second floor, right? Yeah. Then that'd be a hell of a trick. I forced out a laugh. Yeah, probably just my imagination. Well, let me know if it keeps happening. I hung up, but the conversation did nothing to ease my nerves. I wasn't imagining this, and I needed to know what was going on. That night, I left the curtains open. I didn't want to, but I needed to see. I needed proof. I turned off all the lights, leaving the apartment in darkness. The only glow came from the streetlights outside, casting long shadows against the walls. I sat on the couch, phone in hand, recording. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I had been overreacting. Then, just past 2 a.m., something moved. My breath caught in my throat. At first, it was just a shift in the shadows, something subtle, almost imperceptible. But then, it took shape. A figure, standing outside my window. Tall, still, watching. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any details. Just the outline of something not quite human. My hands tightened around my phone. The screen trembled in my grip. The figure didn't move. It didn't react. It just stood there. Then, knock, knock. The sound sent a bolt of terror through me. I forced myself to keep recording. My thumb hovered over the screen, my breath shallow. The knocking came again, slow, deliberate. And then, for the first time, it moved. A slow, unnatural tilt of its head. The shadows seemed to stretch, distorting against the glass. My stomach twisted. Then it leaned forward, closer. I wanted to run, wanted to tear myself away, but I couldn't move. The shape pressed against the glass. And then, a hand. Not flesh and bone. Not something human. Something dark. Wrong. Long, thin fingers pressed against the window, trailing slowly down the glass. A faint, scratching sound filled the room. I choked on my breath. My vision swam. Then, the screen of my phone flickered. For a split second, just before the video cut to black, I saw its face. A glimpse. A fraction of a second. But it was enough. My stomach lurched. My throat tightened. The video was gone. The screen went dark. And the knocking stopped. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Then, in the silence, something else happened. Something worse. The sound of my front door unlocking. The sound of my front door unlocking sent a shockwave through my body. My muscles tensed so hard it felt like my bones might snap. I locked it. I knew I had. I shot up from the couch, heart hammering, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The apartment was dark, but the faint glow from the streetlights bled in through the window. Then the doorknob turned. Slowly, deliberate. The metallic click echoed through the room like a gunshot. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to move, to do something. But I just stood there, paralyzed, watching the handle rotate inch by inch. A long, agonizing creak followed as the door pushed open slightly, leaving a gap of pure, suffocating blackness. And then, a footstep. A single, measured step into my apartment. I stumbled backward, barely catching myself against the couch. My chest tightened, and my lungs burned from holding my breath. The air inside felt heavier, wrong. I couldn't see anything, just that gaping sliver of darkness in my doorway. Another footstep. Then another. Something was inside. I scrambled toward the kitchen, reaching blindly for anything. A knife, a pan, something to defend myself. My fingers closed around a handle. I didn't even look to see what it was before lifting it, holding it in front of me like a pathetic shield. Silence! The door was open, but I couldn't see anyone. I squinted into the dark, trying to force my eyes to adjust. And then I saw it. A shadow, not cast by the dim glow of the streetlights, but something darker, something that seemed to swallow the light around it. It was standing inside my apartment. I could barely make out its form, tall, impossibly still, the edges of its shape flickering like smoke. But its eyes. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, watching me, studying me. The air around me seemed to contract, pressing against my skin, pushing into my lungs like it wanted to suffocate me. My vision blurred, my knees weak. Then, in the silence, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't at the window. It was inside. Soft, rhythmic taps against the wall. Knock, knock, knock. My stomach twisted violently, nausea rolling through me in thick waves. I gripped the handle of whatever I was holding so tightly my knuckles turned white. Knock, knock. The sound moved, first against the kitchen wall, then the hallway, then closer. I could feel it. The thing in front of me hadn't moved, but I could hear it moving, multiplying, surrounding me. Knock! Something brushed my shoulder. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just ran. I barreled through the living room, aiming for the door, but as soon as I reached it, a cold, invisible force slammed it shut. The doorknob twisted violently under my grip, rattling as I yanked on it. I was trapped. Then it spoke. A voice, low and guttural, crawled through the room. You left the window open. My entire body locked up. My breath hitched in my throat. The voice wasn't coming from the thing in the doorway. It was behind me. The moment I turned, everything shifted. The apartment twisted around me, the walls stretching unnaturally, the furniture warping, melting into the floor. The air was suffocating, thick with something that smelled like rot. Then the shadow moved. Not the one by the door. The one standing directly behind me. Its fingers, long, skeletal, not quite human, clawed at my shoulder. A whisper, close to my ear. You let me in. Then the lights flickered, and the world snapped. I woke up on the floor, cold, alone. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. No shadows, no footprints, no sign that anything had been inside. But the door was still unlocked, and in my hand, a single black feather. I lay on the floor for what felt like hours, my fingers clenched around the black feather. My body felt hollow, drained of any strength. Every muscle ached, my throat was raw, and my head throbbed as if I had been screaming. But I didn't remember screaming. The air in the apartment had changed. It wasn't thick and suffocating anymore, but it still didn't feel right. It was silent. Too silent. I pulled myself up, my legs shaky and weak beneath me. My first instinct was to check the door. It was unlocked, just like I had seen before. I reached for the knob, hesitating for a second before pulling it open. The hallway outside was empty. The usual buzz of a distant TV, the muffled voices of neighbors arguing, the hum of the elevator, it was all gone. I stepped out, expecting something. Maybe another shadow lurking in the corners. Maybe another voice whispering from behind me. But there was nothing. I turned back toward my apartment, my breath still uneven. It looked normal, completely normal. Had I imagined everything? No! The knocking, the figure, the voice, the feather in my hand. Something had been here. I needed to leave. I rushed back inside, grabbing my phone from the coffee table. The screen was dark. I pressed the power button, dead. I had just charged it earlier. A wave of unease rolled over me, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my keys, my jacket, and shoved my feet into my sneakers, not even bothering to tie them. The need to get out overpowered everything else. As I reached the door, I hesitated. Something in the back of my mind itched, a question I didn't want to answer but couldn't ignore. I turned toward the window, the one where the knocking had started. The curtains were still drawn. My heart pounded as I forced myself to step closer, my movements slow, hesitant. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stop. But I didn't. I reached out and yanked the curtain open. The street below looked the same. Streetlights flickered against the dark pavement. Cars were parked along the curb, and a few people walked in the distance. Nothing was out of place, but my reflection in the glass was wrong. I took a shaky step back, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection wasn't moving. I lifted my hand. My reflection didn't. It just stood there, watching me. A cold chill crawled up my spine, settling into my bones. The figure in the glass, the one that was supposed to be me, slowly tilted its head. Not in confusion, not in curiosity, but in recognition, as if it had been waiting. I bolted. I yanked the door open and sprinted out, my footsteps pounding against the floor. I didn't stop to lock the door. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran. Down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the night. I didn't stop until I was 3 blocks away, standing under a flickering street lamp, gasping for breath. The city around me was alive, cars rushing past, people walking, voices echoing from open bars. It should have made me feel safer. It didn't. I reached for my phone again, but I already knew it wouldn't turn on. I glanced back toward my apartment building, half expecting to see a dark figure in my window, watching me from where I had just fled. But there was nothing. Still, I wasn't going back. I couldn't. Something had changed. And whatever it was still there. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything behind, my furniture, my clothes, my books. None of it mattered anymore. I didn't even go back for my laptop or any personal belongings. The idea of stepping foot inside that place again made my stomach turn. I stayed with a friend for a few weeks, crashing on his couch while I figured out what to do next. I didn't tell him the full story. How could I? How do you explain that something unnatural had entered your home? That your own reflection stopped following you? Every night, I struggled to sleep. Not because of nightmares. No, the real fear came from something else. Every time I looked at a window, I felt watched. Mirrors? I avoided them entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that my reflection wasn't mine anymore. Eventually, I moved to a new city, far away from that apartment, far away from that street, far away from that window. I picked a place on the top floor of a high-rise, a building with no fire escapes, no easy way for someone or something to knock on my window. For a while, things were normal. But normal doesn't last. The first time it happened, I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light. I was brushing my teeth when I glanced at the mirror. I wasn't smiling, but my reflection was. It was subtle, just the ghost of a grin pulling at the corners of its mouth. I stared, unmoving, praying I was wrong. Then, slowly, the smile faded, and my reflection matched me again. I left the bathroom without finishing. The next time, it was worse. I was in an elevator, alone, the metal doors acting as a distorted mirror. I was standing in the center, arms crossed, waiting for my floor. Then, in the warped reflection, I saw something. A shape standing behind me. A shadow, my shadow. But it was taller, its shoulders broader, and its head tilted, just like before. The doors opened before I could turn around. I stumbled out, barely breathing, my heart slamming against my ribs. When I looked back inside, there was nothing there. But I knew. It followed me. It's still following me. And every time I catch a glimpse of my reflection, just for a second, it smiles. It wasn't much, just a one-story home with faded blue paint and a front porch that creaked under my weight. The kind of place that felt forgotten, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. It was cheap, quiet, and tucked away from the noise of the city, which was exactly what I needed at the time. I had just gone through a messy breakup, and the idea of starting fresh somewhere new felt like the right thing to do. My old apartment was filled with memories I didn't want anymore, and the thought of living in a house, an actual house instead of some cramped apartment, felt like an upgrade. The rent was suspiciously low, but I wasn't about to question it. I signed the lease and packed up my life in a matter of days. When I first arrived, the house smelled like dust and something faintly metallic, but I chalked it up to being empty for so long. The landlord, an older man with a tired face, had barely said anything when he handed me the keys. He just told me to call if anything important happened. His voice had this strange, distant tone, like he was saying something without really saying it. At the time, I figured he was just another landlord who didn't care much about his tenants. The first few days were normal. I spent most of my time unpacking, trying to make the place feel like mine. The furniture I brought barely filled the space, so the house always felt a little empty. The walls were thin, the floors creaked unpredictably, and the plumbing made strange knocking sounds in the night. But it was an old house. Those things were expected. My days followed a simple routine. I worked remotely, so I spent my mornings answering emails and taking calls, my afternoons running errands or going for a jog, and my evenings watching whatever show would help me unwind. The silence of the place was something I had to get used to. Unlike my old apartment, where I could always hear the hum of traffic or the distant chatter of neighbors, this house was still. Too still. Sometimes I'd catch myself holding my breath, listening, waiting for something. But nothing ever happened. At least, not at first. One of the only things I liked about the house was the backyard. It was overgrown and wild, but it had this huge, gnarled tree that looked like it had been there for centuries. There was something strangely comforting about it, like a silent guardian watching over the house. At night, the branches cast long, twisting shadows across my bedroom window. I should have found it unsettling, but I didn't. Not yet. I had a neighbor, an older woman who lived 2 houses down. I only saw her a couple of times, usually in the early mornings when she'd be out watering her plants. The first time I introduced myself, she gave me a long, searching look before nodding. "You're the new tenant," she said, her voice flat. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Just moved in." She hesitated for a second before responding. "Not many people stay there long." Her words stuck with me. They shouldn't have. I'd heard plenty of stories about old houses being hard to rent out for all sorts of reasons. But the way she said it, like it was a fact and not an opinion, sent a small ripple of unease through me. I told myself I was overthinking it. The nights were the hardest part. At first, it was just the usual house noises, creaking wood, pipes shifting, the occasional wind rattling the old windows. But there were moments when the silence felt different, heavier. I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling like something was off, but I could never put my finger on what. The first time I noticed something strange was on my 3rd night in the house. I had just finished watching a show and was about to head to bed when I realized my bedroom door was open. I always kept it closed. I chalked it up to being distracted and shut it again, locking it out of habit. An hour later, I woke up to the sound of something shifting in the hallway. It wasn't loud, just a faint, slow movement, like someone adjusting their weight. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the house had fallen silent again. I told myself it was nothing. The next night, I heard it again. I told myself it was nothing. Just the house settling, or maybe even my own mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. That night, I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a faint sound, soft, deliberate movements just outside my bedroom door. I kept my eyes shut, my breathing steady, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the bedroom door was open again. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly. Maybe a draft from the old vents had pushed it open. But no matter how many times I replayed it in my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I got up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and stepped cautiously into the hallway. The house was silent, the morning light filtering in through the half-closed blinds. Everything looked normal. But then I saw it. The chair in the living room, the one I had left pushed in against the dining table, was pulled back, angled slightly toward the hallway. Like someone had been sitting there, watching. A chill crawled up my spine. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the chair, trying to convince myself that I had done it. Maybe I had moved it without thinking. Maybe I had left it like that the night before and just didn't remember. I forced myself to shake it off. It was too early to start jumping to conclusions. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I kept myself busy, working, running errands, anything to distract myself. But that feeling of unease clung to me like a shadow. I started paying closer attention to everything. The way the floor creaked under my feet, the faint groan of the pipes, the way the air felt too still at times. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong, that I was just getting used to the house. That's all it was, adjustment. The mind plays tricks in new places. But as I stood in my bedroom, staring at the door, I felt a familiar prickle of unease at the back of my neck. This time, I locked it and pushed a chair up against it, just in case. I lay in bed, listening. The house felt different. Then I heard it. A soft, almost hesitant movement in the hallway. Not the pipes. Not the old wooden floors shifting under the weight of time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling. Every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I wanted to tell myself it was my imagination, that I was just exhausted and overthinking everything. But then, slowly, the doorknob rattled. It wasn't violent, just a soft, testing movement, like someone checking to see if it was locked. My throat tightened. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The chair I had pushed against the door didn't move. Whoever, whatever, was on the other side didn't try to force their way in. They just stood there. Minutes passed. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't hear footsteps retreating, just silence. A silence so thick it felt suffocating. I don't know how long I stayed like that, staring at the ceiling, heart hammering in my chest. But eventually, I must have fallen asleep out of pure exhaustion. When I woke up, the door was still locked. The chair was still in place. But something was different. The closet door, the one I never opened, was slightly ajar. And I swear I could smell something faintly metallic in the air. I sat up in bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. My eyes were locked on the slightly open closet door. A part of me wanted to get up, close it, and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't move. For several long moments, I just listened. The house was silent, too silent. No creaking floors, no distant hum of the refrigerator. Just an eerie, oppressive stillness. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take slow, steady breaths. It's just an old house. That's all. But that didn't explain the closet. I had never used it, not since moving in. It was one of those awkwardly small spaces with a single wooden rod and an overhead shelf, and I kept it empty. So why was it open? I slid my feet onto the cold floor, heart hammering, and stood up. My body felt heavy, sluggish, like something unseen was weighing me down. Every step I took toward the closet felt like moving through thick air. When I reached the door, I hesitated. A faint smell clung to the air, something metallic mixed with something damp and old, like rotting wood. My fingers trembled as I reached for the knob. I pulled the door open all the way. Nothing. The closet was completely empty. No hidden compartments, no old coats, no forgotten boxes. Just darkness and that lingering smell. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. Maybe I had left it slightly open without realizing it. Maybe the air pressure had nudged it. I shut it, pressing against it firmly, making sure it latched. Then, for good measure, I dragged a small storage bin in front of it before crawling back into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the sound of the doorknob rattling, the slow footsteps in the hallway. The next morning, I woke up groggy and unsettled. The house was quiet again, but now it felt different, charged, like something unseen was watching. I went through my usual routine, trying to push the unease away. Coffee, a quick shower. But as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, running a towel through my hair, something made me freeze. The mirror. At first, I thought it was a smudge, but as I leaned closer, my stomach dropped. There were fingerprints on the glass. Not mine. They were too small, too faint, almost like a child's. The ridges were barely visible, but they were there, scattered across the lower half of the mirror, as if someone had pressed their hands against it and dragged their fingers downward. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I wiped the mirror clean, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe I had touched it without realizing it. Maybe it was just condensation from the shower. But deep down, I knew better. The unease stayed with me the entire day. I caught myself checking over my shoulder, jumping at small sounds. Every time I turned a corner, I felt like I'd see something standing there. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house. Bedroom door, windows, even the closet. I left a light on in the hallway, just in case. I barely slept. At some point, I must have dozed off, but then I woke up to something new. A voice! A soft, faint whisper, just outside my door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent ice through my veins. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't angry. It was curious, almost amused. I sat up slowly, gripping the blanket so hard my knuckles ached. The whispering stopped. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 soft, deliberate taps against my bedroom door. I couldn't breathe. For several agonizing minutes, I sat frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it'd pass out. Then, silence. I forced myself to move, to reach for my phone. I needed proof. If I could record something, anything, it would make this real. With shaking hands, I opened the voice recorder and hit record. I held my breath and waited. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally exhaled. Maybe whoever, or whatever, was toying with me was gone. I stayed awake until dawn. When morning came, I checked my phone. The recording was still going. I hit stop and replayed it. At first, all I heard was silence. Then, a faint static, like interference. But as I turned up the volume, my stomach twisted. Buried beneath the static was a voice. A whisper. It was faint, almost too quiet to make out, but I knew it hadn't come from me. Open the door. I dropped the phone. I couldn't stay in the house. Not that day. Not alone. I grabbed my keys and left, not even bothering to lock up behind me. I needed space. Fresh air. Anything to get away from whatever was inside that house. I spent the day driving aimlessly, stopping at a diner for coffee I couldn't even drink. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. By the time I pulled into the driveway that evening, the sky was already dark. The house loomed in the dim porch light, silent and waiting. I stepped inside and flipped on every light I could. The brightness did little to calm me. Then I saw the footprints. Faint, dusty prints leading from my bedroom door to the closet. Small, bare, like those of a child. The breath left my lungs. My chest tightened as I followed them, step by step, to where they stopped in front of the closet. The door was open again, and this time, something was inside. I couldn't see it, only the darkness stretching beyond the threshold. But I felt it, a presence, something waiting, watching. I backed away, stomach twisting into knots. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, to leave, and never look back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I reached for the closet door and, with a trembling hand, pulled it shut. Then I locked it. And this time, I didn't just block it with a storage bin. I moved a heavy dresser in front of it, shoving it with all the strength I had left. I stood there for a long time, hands braced against the wood, listening. Nothing. But I knew this wasn't over. That night, I didn't sleep at all. And when the sun finally rose, I knew what I had to do. I had to find out what was really in this house. The dresser in front of the closet door felt like a weak barrier. I knew it wouldn't stop whatever was inside. It was never about the closet itself. I had spent the entire day trying to push the thought away, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined everything. But now, standing in my room as night settled over the house, I knew I was out of excuses. I had to face this. I grabbed my phone and opened the voice recording app again. My fingers hovered over the screen before I finally pressed record. "Who are you?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Silence!" I swallowed hard, staring at the closet door. "Why are you here?" "Nothing." I exhaled, feeling a ridiculous wave of relief. Maybe it really was just in my head. Maybe the stress, the lack of sleep. Then, through the phone speaker, a click, a sharp, deliberate sound. And then, "Let me out." My blood ran cold. The voice was wrong. It was quiet, breathy, layered, like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping each other. Male, female, young, old, all at the same time. I stumbled backward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The air in the room shifted. It became heavier, suffocating, as if something unseen had filled the space, pressing against my skin, my chest, my throat. The closet door creaked. I turned and ran. Down the hall. Through the living room. I barely registered the way the floor groaned under my steps. My only thought was to get out. But as I reached the front door, my body locked up. I don't mean I hesitated. I mean I physically couldn't move. My fingers froze just inches from the doorknob. My breath hitched, my chest tightening like something unseen had wrapped itself around me. Then the whisper came again. Not from my phone. Not from the closet. From right behind me. "Don't leave me." A breath of air touched my neck. Cold, damp, real. I spun around, gasping, and the lights flickered. For the briefest moment, I saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, impossibly long arms. No eyes, no mouth, just a silhouette standing at the end of the hallway, watching. The moment the light stabilized, it was gone. I grabbed the doorknob, yanked the door open, and sprinted outside. The night air was sharp, cold against my damp skin. My chest ached, lungs burning as I sucked in deep breaths. I half expected something to follow me, to pull me back inside, but nothing did. The house was silent again. I stood there, trembling, staring at the open doorway. I should have gotten in my car. I should have left. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't over. If I didn't do something now, I would never be free of it. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking as I scrolled through my contacts. I called the only person I could think of. An hour later, I sat in my car, parked a few blocks away from the house, waiting. The street was quiet, lined with dimly lit houses. My headlights were off, the engine running low. I was exhausted, my body screaming for rest, but adrenaline wouldn't let me close my eyes. Then, a car pulled up behind me. I exhaled, gripping the steering wheel as the driver's door opened. He stepped out, older, mid-50s, dressed in a thick jacket, his face lined with exhaustion. I had met him once when I first moved in, Tom, the previous owner. He hadn't wanted to talk much back then. But now, after my frantic call, He had agreed to meet. I rolled down my window. You came. Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You said something's been happening in the house. I nodded. Yeah, and I think you know what. He didn't respond at first. His eyes flicked toward my house, shadowed under the dim streetlight. He looked uneasy. I should have warned you, he muttered. I sat up straighter. Warn me about what? Another long pause. Then, finally, there was a boy. Lived there before me. No one really knows what happened to him. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? Tom sighed again, leaning against his car. House sat empty for a while before I bought it. But the neighbors, they remember, said the kid was quiet, kept to himself. Then one day, he just disappeared. I swallowed hard. And no one found him? He shook his head. Parents claimed he ran away, but people always said there was something off about it. One day, the kid was there. The next, he wasn't. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I thought of the footprints, the closet. The whisper let me out. Where was his room? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Tom met my gaze. Your bedroom. I didn't want to go back inside. Every part of me screamed to leave and never return. But I had to. Tom left me with one final warning. If it wants to be found, it will be. That night, I stepped back into my house, armed with nothing but my phone and sheer desperation. I had to know the truth. I stood in my room, staring at the dresser I had shoved against the closet. My breath came in slow, measured inhales. Do it now, or you never will. I grabbed the edge of the dresser and dragged it away. The wood scraped against the floor, echoing in the still air. Then, with shaking hands, I reached for the closet door. I opened it. At first, I saw nothing. Just the same empty space. The same smell of damp air. But then, the floorboards inside the closet looked different. I knelt down, heart hammering. The wood didn't match the rest of the house. It was newer, replaced. My fingers trembled as I pressed against the boards. They didn't budge. But as I ran my hand along the edge, I felt something. A gap. A loose board. I wedged my fingers under it and pulled. The wood groaned before finally giving way. And underneath, a hollow space. A crawl space. The air that rushed out was thick, stale, and the smell rot. I gagged, covering my nose, but forced myself to look. A shape, small, curled, the remains of a child. My vision blurred, stomach twisting violently. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers, the knocking, the footprints. It had been here all along. A sudden gust of air rushed through the room, slamming the closet door shut. Then, footsteps. Not outside. Not down the hall. Behind me. I turned, and I wasn't alone. The air in the room had changed, dense, suffocating. A presence loomed behind me, cold and heavy. My chest ached with the effort to breathe. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. Slowly, I shifted my head, inch by inch, until my eyes landed on the corner of the room. And there it was. A figure, small and twisted, its limbs too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood just at the edge of the dim light, its features lost in the darkness. The whispers started again, soft, layered, curling around me like cold fingers. You found me. I scrambled back, pressing against the closet door, my pulse hammering in my ears. You found me. The voice was distant and near at the same time, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The figure didn't move, but I felt it watching. My mind raced. I had uncovered the truth. The remains under the floorboards, hidden away for God knows how long. The boy, this thing. Was it him, or was it something else? I had no answers, and I didn't want them. I needed to get out. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed off the floor, lunging for the door. My fingers fumbled with the handle, slick with sweat. I yanked it open and ran, my feet barely touching the ground. As I passed through the hallway, the whispers followed, growing, overlapping, filling the air with something wrong. The walls groaned. The floor creaked. The whole house seemed to shift, breathing around me. I didn't look back. I hit the front door with full force, throwing it open and stumbling onto the porch. Cold night air wrapped around me like a shock of ice. And then, silence! The whispers stopped. The house stood behind me, dark and still. The door remained open, revealing nothing but the yawning blackness inside. I turned and ran to my car. I didn't sleep that night. I drove aimlessly for hours, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to pull into an empty parking lot. I sat there, staring at the steering wheel, the events of the night looping in my head. What had I uncovered? Was it really the boy? Or was it something that had taken his place? I thought about Tom's warning. If it wants to be found, it will be. Had I made a mistake? By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. I wasn't going back. The house was not my home anymore. I called a real estate agent the next morning, listed the house, avoided answering too many questions. A few weeks later, it sold. I packed my things and left, never stepping foot inside again. I told myself I was free, that it was over. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It started small. The feeling of being watched. A chill that crept through my apartment at night. Then, the knocking. At first, it was just once or twice. Faint, like the building settling. But then, one night, it came again. 3 soft knocks. My stomach turned to ice. I slowly turned my head toward the closet. The door was slightly open. A whisper slithered through the silence. You found me. I don't talk about the house anymore. I don't tell people what I saw, what I heard. Not because I don't believe it happened, but because I know no one else will. And honestly, I don't want them to. Some things are better left buried. For months after I left, I convinced myself it was over. That whatever had been in that house, whatever I had woken up, had stayed behind. But I was wrong. The knocking followed me. Always late at night. Always 3 soft taps. Never louder than a breath, but impossible to ignore. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just the old pipes. The wind. My own paranoia clinging to the edges of my mind. Then came the whispers. Faint. Distant. Just out of reach. It'd be brushing my teeth, about to spit into the sink, when it'd hear it. A voice, low and broken, curling from the closet. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, barely on the edge of sleep, a breath against my ear. You found me. The worst part? I never saw anything. Not once. But I felt it. Watching. Waiting. And that was worse than any shadow in the dark. I stopped sleeping. I kept all the lights on. Kept my closet door shut tight. But it didn't matter. It was always there. One night, I decided to fight back. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, staring at the closet door. The knocking had just stopped. The air felt thick, unmoving. I swallowed hard and said, "What do you want?" "Silence!" Then, slowly, the closet door creaked open. No, I didn't stay to see what was inside. I grabbed my keys, ran out of my apartment, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked outside an all-night diner, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I couldn't live like this. Something had followed me. Something I had let out. and I didn't know how to stop it. I moved again, left everything behind, started over, but I knew it wasn't really a fresh start. I still hear the knocking sometimes. Not every night, just sometimes. I'll be walking down a quiet hallway or sitting alone in my car, and it'll hear it. Soft, careful, 3 taps. I don't react anymore. I don't acknowledge it, because I know that's what it wants. Maybe one day it'll get tired of waiting, or maybe it never will. This happened 3 years ago when I moved into an old house in a small town. The kind of town where everyone knows each other, and the only excitement comes from local gossip or the occasional storm knocking out the power. He'd just gone through a rough breakup, and moving into that house was supposed to be a fresh start. A new place, a new routine, and hopefully a chance to clear my head. The house wasn't anything special, just a modest 2-bedroom place on the edge of town. It had been sitting empty for a while before I got it, and I figured that's why the rent was so cheap. The previous tenant had apparently left in a hurry, but the landlord didn't say much beyond that. I didn't ask. I was just grateful to find something affordable. The first few weeks were quiet. My days were spent at work, and my nights were uneventful. I wasn't much of a social person, so I kept to myself. After dinner, I'd settle into my worn-out couch with whatever book I'd picked up that week. Sometimes I'd stay up too late scrolling through my phone, watching random videos until my eyes burned. The house was old, sure, but nothing felt particularly off. Not yet. My only complaint was the cold. No matter how high I turned up the heat, the floor always felt icy beneath my feet. I figured it had something to do with the old wooden planks, maybe poor insulation. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel like the cold was seeping into me, settling into my bones. But it wasn't unbearable, just annoying. The layout of the house was simple: a living room that opened into a small kitchen, a short hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom tucked in the back. The floors creaked when I walked, but that was normal for a house its age. The walls had a few cracks, and there was a faint musty smell that never fully went away, no matter how many times I aired the place out. At first, I told myself the noises were just the house settling. It wasn't like I hadn't lived in old buildings before. Creaks, groans, even the occasional scratching sound. It was all just part of the charm, right? But then came the nights when the sounds felt too specific. A shuffle here, a faint tap there, always from the floorboards. I tried to ignore it. Maybe a rodent had gotten inside. Maybe the pipes were making noise beneath the house. It was an old place, after all. Things made noise. But the cold never went away, and neither did the sounds. The first time I noticed something truly off, I had just gotten home from work. It was early November, and the days were getting shorter, which meant by the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun had already dipped behind the trees. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at winter creeping in. I remember unlocking the door and stepping inside, my boots clicking against the wooden floor. The house was quiet, as it always was. I kicked off my shoes, hung up my jacket, and walked into the kitchen to grab a drink. That's when I heard it. A noise! Not the usual creaks or groans of an aging house, but something different, subtle but deliberate. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. I froze. It was coming from beneath the floor. I stood there, my grip tightening around the glass in my hand. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but it sent a chill through me. My first thought was, a leak. Maybe the pipes under the house were acting up, expanding with the cold. Or maybe I had mice. The place was old, and I had yet to really inspect the crawlspace. I put the glass down and stepped into the living room, my ears straining. The tapping had stopped. Just silence now, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the wind rattling against the windows. I shook my head, exhaling. It's nothing. Dinner was simple, a frozen meal, heated up and eaten in front of the TV. I was halfway through a documentary when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder. I sat up, remote clutched in my hand. It sounded like it was coming from the far end of the room, beneath the floor near the hallway. I muted the TV. Silence! I waited, barely breathing. Then, tap, tap. 2 distinct knocks. Slow, measured. I stood up so fast the plate in my lap clattered to the floor. My heart was hammering now, my pulse loud in my ears. What the hell was that? I tried to think logically. Maybe something had fallen inside the vents beneath the house. Maybe there were animals down there. But something about the pattern of the sound. It wasn't random. It wasn't the scurry of a mouse or the shifting of old pipes. It had a rhythm, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I spent the next few minutes pacing, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be the house settling, and after a while, I forced myself to sit back down. I turned the volume back up, determined to ignore it. But when I woke up around 2 a.m., cold sweat clinging to my skin, the noise was back. This time, it was closer. I woke up to the sound of tapping, not the distant, occasional taps from earlier, but something much closer, much louder. It was coming from beneath my bed. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I lay completely still, my breath shallow. The room was dark except for the faint glow from the street lamp outside, casting weak, distorted light through my curtains. My mind struggled to catch up, unsure if I was still dreaming. Then, tap, tap, tap. I shot up, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sound was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate, and worst of all, too precise to be random. I threw the blankets off and swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet hitting the freezing wooden floor. I reached for my phone, gripping it tight as I turned on the flashlight. The weak beam of light spilled across the room, illuminating the worn floorboards, the door slightly ajar, the chair in the corner where it left my jacket. Everything looked normal, except for the feeling in my gut, that crawling sensation of being watched. I lowered the light toward the floor, hesitating. There's nothing there. Just look. Get it over with. Taking a deep breath, I leaned forward, angling my phone's light beneath the bed. Nothing. Dust. A few stray socks. The storage box I hadn't unpacked yet. No signs of anything that could explain the noise. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe my half-asleep brain had turned the house's normal creaks into something sinister. I stood up, stretched my tense shoulders, and decided to get some water. Maybe if I shook off the nerves, I could actually sleep. The hallway was quiet. the floor creaking softly under my weight as I walked. The air felt thicker somehow, like the house itself was pressing down on me. I reached the kitchen, grabbed a glass, and filled it at the sink. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, steady and constant. I took a sip, let out a slow breath. Maybe I was just on edge from being in a new place. Then something scratched beneath my feet. Not a creak, not a tap, a dragging sound. Slow, purposeful. I nearly dropped the glass. Every hair on my body stood on end as I took an instinctive step back. My breathing was too loud now, echoing in the quiet kitchen. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Scratch, scratch. My stomach turned. The sound was coming directly from under me. I bolted back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me, my pulse a deafening drum in my ears. I locked it, stood there, my back pressed against the wood, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The silence stretched. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, every muscle in my body locked tight. But no more noises came. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I crawled back into bed, my body too tense to truly relax. I kept the light on, my phone clutched in my hand. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The light streaming through my window made the night feel like some distant nightmare. But the pit in my stomach hadn't gone away. Something wasn't right with this house. That day at work, I could barely focus. My mind kept drifting back to the sounds, the tapping, the scratching. I searched for logical explanations. Maybe there were rats or some kind of animal trapped under the house. But the idea didn't sit right with me. Rats didn't knock. They didn't scratch like that. By the time I got home, I had made up my mind. I needed to check beneath the house. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and headed outside. The entrance to the crawl space was a rusted metal hatch on the side of the house, half buried under overgrown weeds. I hesitated before crouching down, my fingers curling around the edge. It took some effort, but I finally yanked it open. A musty, damp smell wafted up, thick with the scent of old wood and earth. The space beneath the house was shrouded in darkness, the beams of my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. I exhaled sharply and lowered myself in. The air was thick, stale. The wooden beams supporting the house stretched around me like skeletal ribs, dust swirling in the flashlight's beam. I moved forward cautiously, my hands brushing against cold, packed dirt. That's when I saw them. Marks! Long, deep scratches along the wooden beams. Not random. Not the gnawing of an animal. They were patterns. Intentional. My breath hitched. My flashlight flickered. And then, from somewhere deeper in the crawl space, tap, tap, tap. I dropped the flashlight. I scrambled backward as my flashlight rolled across the dirt, its beam flickering wildly in the darkness. My hands dug into the cold earth, my breathing shallow and ragged. The tapping had come from inside the crawl space. Am not alone down here. I forced myself to move, reaching for the flashlight with trembling fingers. The moment I grabbed it, the tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. Closer this time. I swung the light toward the sound, my stomach twisting into knots. The beam caught movement, something shifting just beyond the wooden beams, too fast for me to fully register. My skin went ice cold. I wasn't imagining it. Something was down here. The tapping turned into scraping, a slow, deliberate drag of something against the wooden supports of the house. My breath hitched as I aimed the flashlight, my shaking hands barely able to hold it steady. And then I saw it. A hand. Not an animal. Not some tangled mess of roots or debris. A human hand, pale and dirty, fingers gnarled and too long, curling around one of the beams. I stopped breathing. The hand moved, fingers flexing, nails scraping against the wood in a slow, agonizing motion. Then another hand appeared, grasping lower on the beam. My vision blurred as my pulse thundered in my ears. My entire body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, trapped in some sick nightmare. The hands began to pull, and then it emerged. A face! Sunken, hollow eyes locked onto mine from the darkness, its skin stretched thin over sharp bones. The mouth twitched, lips cracking as they parted slightly, revealing teeth, too many teeth, lined unevenly in a jagged row. The thing's neck jerked unnaturally, as if adjusting to my presence. Then it smiled. I bolted. I don't even remember how I got out. 1 second I was on my hands and knees, and the next I was scrambling out of the crawl space, my limbs burning as I hurled myself onto the grass outside. My hands slipped on the damp earth, but I didn't stop. I grabbed the metal hatch, slamming it down with all my strength. The second it shut, a thud hit the other side. I stumbled back, my chest rising and falling in sharp, panicked gasps. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the flashlight. I expected the hatch to burst open at any second, for those hands to claw their way out, but nothing happened. Silence! The only sound was the blood rushing through my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body locked in place, my eyes glued to the rusted metal. The air was thick with tension, pressing down on me like an unbearable weight. Then, from beneath the ground, tap, 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 soft, patient. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I was inside the house, my back pressed against the door, lungs burning, sweat slicking my palms. My entire body was trembling, my mind still trying to catch up to what I had just seen. That thing, those hands, that smile. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The crawlspace hatch was still shut, but that tapping, I could still hear it. Soft, rhythmic, like a taunt. I needed to leave. Now. My hands fumbled as I grabbed my phone. I could barely think straight, my fingers slick with sweat as I tried to dial for help. But before I could press the call button, the tapping stopped. My stomach clenched. The air in the room felt wrong, too heavy, too still. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then, creak! A floorboard. Not from beneath the house. From inside the house. I turned my head slowly, dread clawing its way up my spine. The hallway was dark, stretching toward the living room like a black hole. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run. Then, from the darkness, tap, tap, tap. My breath hitched. The sound was coming from the hallway now. It had moved. I gripped my phone tighter, my thumb hovering over the call button, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from the hallway. It felt like if I did, something would be there when I turned back. Another creak. Closer this time. That's when I saw it. A shadow. Tall. Thin. Standing just beyond where the dim light from the kitchen met the darkness of the hallway. My stomach twisted so violently, I thought I would throw up. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I stepped backward, my pulse hammering in my ears. My back hit the wall, and my phone nearly slipped from my hands. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen in place. And then, in a slow, unnatural motion, it tilted its head, the same way it had in the crawlspace. My body finally responded. I bolted for the door, ripping it open so fast I nearly fell. I didn't even bother shutting it behind me. I just ran. Out into the night, my feet pounding against the pavement as I sprinted down the street. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. I slammed the car into drive, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The house sat in the distance, dark and silent. But the door was wide open. And just before I turned the corner, just before the house disappeared from view, I saw something. A figure standing in the doorway, watching me leave. Then it stepped back inside. The door closed. I never went back. I never went back to that house. The night I fled, I drove aimlessly for hours, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The moment I shut the door behind me, I collapsed onto the bed, my body shaking so violently I could barely breathe. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, its hollow stare, its jagged teeth, the way it tilted its head as if it knew something I didn't. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I was done. I didn't ask for my deposit back, didn't bother explaining why. I just said I was leaving. I could hear the confusion in his voice, but I didn't care. I was done. I found a new place across town, an apartment in a crowded building with no crawl space, no basement, no hidden gaps beneath the floor. I told myself that as long as I put enough distance between me and that house, I would be fine. That whatever was in there would stay there. But I was wrong. The first few nights in my new apartment, I barely slept. Every creak, every shift in the walls sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I had let my mind get carried away. Then, one night, I woke up cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from a draft or a broken heater. This was different. A deep, unnatural chill that settled into my bones. My breath came out in short, misty puffs. And then, tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the closet. My stomach dropped. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just stared at the closed door, my pulse pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then, the doorknob turned. I was out of bed before I even realized what I was doing, scrambling toward the hallway. My hands fumbled with the lock as I yanked the door open, my breath ragged. I didn't stop to grab anything. I just ran. I never went back to that apartment either.